Hello, this is Mike Oliver with another in this Guiding Principles of SOA series. This one is probably one of the easiest to explain and most important, but for some reason gets dropped. Most people that are trying to look at SOA in terms of their companies just forget about this. I think it's because of the way they used to do things. It's always worked for them in the past, yada yada. So you want to identify services through collaboration with business and technology stakeholders. Now, let's go over the goals of SOA and one of them is always stated as being an alignment of IT and business. So if that's true, then therefore the services need to be designed in collaboration with business. And when I say in collaboration with business, I'm not talking about just business gives IT their requirements and IT delivers back to business a solution. It's not really about that. You want to avoid the temptation to decompose into services just because you can. I've seen it happen in organizations where they decide that SOA is a good idea, so they go to a big application and say, oh, let's take their API and wrap it in SOA web services, and we'll do it every place that we see an API. And then they have a whole bunch of services that do very little more than just data model transformation, and yet that service is used once by some other application to extract some information. So it could be done easily within another service, but yet they build a separate service for us just because they can. The collaboration should begin in the vetting, analysis, and design phases. You know, in most software development life cycles, you have a phase where the business proposes something and then somebody goes through and looks at it and says, this is feasible, or you know, this is going to be too expensive, or something along those lines. That is the stage where you want to be collaborating between business and IT, and I'll get into a little more details in a moment, but that's where it should start. It's not a matter of looking at the design and saying, is this cost effective? You want to be collaborating early on. A service development lifecycle with a service registry analysis phase that is done by the librarian should occur well before design. Give you an example. We have a proposed application, and in that proposed application there are several different proposed services. A service that is already listed in the service registry may not be obvious to the people writing the requirements. So the librarian really is the one that goes in and looks at the service registry and says, this service is 85% of the requirement, and only 15% needs to be written, instead of writing a whole new service that is 100% of the requirement and leaving 85% on the table. The standardized service contract and domain schema need to be analyzed as well. If you're building a new service, it should follow the standardized service contract and domain schema. If it doesn't, then you need to look at maybe enhancing the domain schema, because you can literally always add to a schema, or look and see if there's some repurposing, or if you have written your container of the schema in such a way that you can just leverage some unbounded array or some other way to pass a tidbit of information that might be missing, then that all needs to be analyzed early on. Alignment considerations. Does the proposed service satisfy a real business need? In other words, you have a solution that you're trying to come up with, and you decompose that solution into a number of steps, and you write the flow chart, you look at the sequence diagram, and you say, here's where we're going to put this service. But does the service itself satisfy a real business need, or is it just needed in that sequence diagram? And the reason I say that is because it goes back to that original statement where you don't want to build a service just because you can. You need to keep things as simple as possible, which doesn't necessarily mean everything needs to be a service. Does the proposed service have any reuse opportunity? If it's a service that is just used once by one application, then it probably should not be written as a service, but written into the orchestration or the service that is calling it, or a composite service, or maybe even a subcontroller of a composite service. It probably should not be a service, atomic service, or adapter on its own. Does the proposed service have any performance impact? Boy, this is really big. If you look at the overhead of a service, if a service is going to be a memory hog because of some aspect of the data, or if it's going to be a processing hog that requires more threads, it needs to be considered early on. Maybe that service is necessary, and therefore you have to allow for it in your design, or maybe it can be further decomposed so that it can be more easily scaled, or maybe it can be changed from stateful to stateless, or some other consideration, which means you need to collaborate with business early on to see what can be done to have the least amount of impact on performance. Does the proposed service require any changes to the domain shared canonical schema? Going back to a previous point, you need to be considering this in alignment with business. How important is this data element? Is it something that happens occasionally, on error, on some contingency? Is it something that can be handled without modifying the schema? Where will the service be deployed? Now, this may be tied back into the performance impact and reuse and everything else, but where will the service be deployed? And depending on how your data centers are organized, and depending on whether you're using software-defined networking or whatever your environment is, that needs to be considered again early on. Will a proposed service enable some future planned application? This is again something that you must collaborate with business. Business might tell you, here's a set of requirements. And they don't bother to tell you that this is the first of 12 different systems that they're anticipating, and this is just the first. And that could impact how you design your services. It could impact on the schema. It could impact on a number of different things that are much better done early on than to have to go back and touch something else and maybe have to revamp a service down the road to accommodate something else down the road. So this is one of the key areas where future planned applications need to be considered, and that's where a strategic plan, an enterprise architecture plan, is very important. Will the proposed service be stateless? A stateful application or a synchronous application will have impacts because they tend to have wait states, and wait states are the bane to performance. So you might want to consider that early on. Is there a way of using a state manager instead of having the message and the services be stateful? A number of different approaches that you can take if you consider this early on. Will the service be autonomous? In other words, are there dependencies of this service on some other service? And this could be a database, it could be a piece of shared memory, it could be some dependency outside of the local environment. So, the no-go factors. service is available in use as an API now. Okay? And if that's true, then maybe you don't want to write a new service because the API is already in use. The service will never be reused. Obviously, if it's never going to be reused, then it's probably not a good candidate for a service. Service must be stateful due to transactional needs. That may also be a reason to not provide it as an atomic service. It may or may not. You have to look at it. Cost to develop service is not justified by reuse or composability. That's a simple, build or buy decision. Business requirements are unclear or doubtful. The service would not be autonomous and may be impactful on existing services. That's where you want to look at the other factors and the environment and where you're going to deploy it and the resources available and so forth. Here are some real-world examples. One of the tech teams had an API they wanted to convert to a REST JSON service. And they wanted to do that because they were using, in this particular domain, REST and JSON because it was largely web pages and so forth. And they had this API, and it was something they purchased, and it did good work for them. And they had already built a number of connectors to this API, and they just thought because it was it didn't have a REST JSON interface, that it would be better if they did. Well, guess what? They didn't have the resources to get rid of the API calls. They added the REST JSON interface, which meant more code to maintain, and now they've got both. Another one. The business asked for a solution. The proposed SOA-based solution would take longer and cost more. So, what happened? Did the business say, well, let's just go the lowest cost route. Let's get this delivered as quickly as possible. But the SOA-based solution would have future benefits. And the SOA-based solution would allow for reuse of existing components. The SOA-based solution would have a lower cost of maintenance. As it turns out, in this case, they decided to go with the SOA-based solution. In 2 weeks after deploying the solution and the new services, they got a change from marketing. And they had to go back in and make changes to the solution. But because they went with the SOA-based solution, they only had to change one component service. The time saved, because of the difference between the two proposed designs, one a standalone application and one the SOA-based application, was huge. Probably several man-months of effort. Lastly, an existing service was used by several other services and some applications. And there was a change request that came down. And there was an API that needed to be called. And they looked at different ways of doing it. And they had not implemented a canonical schema. And what they ended up doing was writing a new facade to the existing service to do the data model transformation. Well, data model transformation is expensive. And because they hadn't done the collaboration with business early on, they had to go back and make that decision of whether to update the existing service or write a facade, and the facade had a performance impact. So not doing the collaboration with business was very costly. Thank you very much, and see you on the next guiding principle.